I can't think of anything more hateful. You're proposing ethnic cleansing of black and brown people. This is more extreme than anything any anti-immigrant movement has ever proposed before. So it's about as hateful as it could possibly be. Frankly, it's downright scary.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me for this latest episode of Hate Comes to Main Street. My guest today is Heidi Beirich. She's the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's an expert on the American and European far right, including white supremacists, anti-immigrant, anti-government, and other extremist movements. I began by asking her about growing calls by some on the far right for what they call remigration. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start out with terminology because we hear a lot of conversation about deportation of people who are in the country illegally. We also hear about remigration. Are those one and the same, or do you view those as separate terms?
Well, deportation is an aspect of the remigration policy program. I do think of them as separate. One is sort of a tactic, and one is a philosophy that has been conceived of by white nationalists, actually one Austrian white nationalist, Martin Sellner, as a way to remove people of color from countries that he believes are historically white. So it's a different animal than deportation, but of course it would involve deportation. And frankly, at its most extreme, remigration is really about ethnically cleansing countries of black and brown people.
So deportation, by definition, it seems to me, involves people who may be in the country illegally, maybe undocumented. Remigration could include people who are in the country legally, even U.S. citizens. Am I right in that?
That's right. Remigration proposes much more than deporting people who don't have the appropriate paperwork, right? Who aren't in a place legally. Uh, what remigration wants to do is such things as denaturalizing citizens that they don't believe belong in a country. Mostly we're talking about immigrants, refugees, those kinds of folks, denaturalizing them and removing them from the country under the remigration plan, which Martin Sellner, this Austrian former neo-Nazi, came up with. They also talk about removing people who aren't appropriately not sure what the right word is, sort of conditioned to be in a country. So there's a political aspect to this as well. There's the removal of people who aren't racially white, but there's also the removal of people who are maybe seen as anti-German or anti-American. So it's a much broader thing than removing people from a country who don't have the right papers to be legally there. This is about reconstituting the nature of a population of a country.
Now, in listening to the people on the far right, and I was actually right before you and I started talking, I was listening to a podcast, and they say, "Well, we're just trying to go back to the country as it was originally envisioned." What's wrong with that?
Well, look, the kind of country what they're talking about when they say originally envisioned is an all-white population, which first of all is a fantasy, right? The United States was not all white from its beginning. There are, of course, Native Americans here, among other populations. There was the forcible removal of Africans into slavery into the United States, and there were people of other faiths and other colors already in the United States. What they're talking about is an imagined white rule. That's what they're talking about. So they've got this kind of Ozzie and Harriet view of the past when white people were dominant, white people weren't as criminal, white people were smarter, white people created a better civilization. This is what they're talking about. And at its core, it's white supremacy. The idea that you can't live in a country that is civilized, democratic, etc., if you have non-white people in it. And so, at the base of this, it's just deeply rooted racism.
If they were to get their way, what what would happen, do you think?
Well, if this plan of remigration were actually to happen, as I mentioned, it would be a war crime. It would be ethnic cleansing because you would have to forcibly remove I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people out of the country, meaning you'd have to go in, rip them out of their homes, throw them into buses or trains or something, remove them, put them on planes, and at a level that would, far, far outpace the kinds of things that we're seeing the Trump administration do today. And it would mean that anybody who, had a skin color that is a tone darker than mine would be at threat of forcible removal. It would erase any rights that people have as citizens. And of course, it would end the Constitution, right? Because this would be anti constitutional at its core.
Yeah, in fact, some of them are quite frank that that they don't care if they have to throw away the Constitution to achieve the kind of country they want. I think they're pretty blatant about it.
Yeah, they're quite blatant about it. I mean, these aren't people who are necessarily beholden to democracy or the Constitution. These are white supremacists who want a country ruled by white people, white men, most likely. And that doesn't have anything really to do at the end of the day with American democracy as it was conceived of from the beginning, even with its racist underpinnings. This is not what these people are about. So this is a, white supremacist fantasy of all white families in a country, probably patriarchal, and it's a different kind of society than the one that we have. And it would mean probably close to a third or more of Americans would have to be removed if people whose views were politically different than these white supremacists, it would be even higher than that.
I am represented by a member of Congress, Andy Ogles, who is openly talking about remigration. I follow a lot of accounts that talk about remigration. It seems from my perspective that this talk is intensifying on the far right, but maybe I'm just absorbed in it. I mean, what is your sense? I mean, is this talk intensifying, especially as we see perhaps the Trump administration not accomplishing what some had hoped it would accomplish?
There's no question that it's intensifying. I mean, here's a couple things that are important here. First of all, the concept of remigration is barely 4 years old. It was first came to light from this guy, Martin Sellner in Austria, in a meeting that he had with far-right politicians in Germany. And the evidence of the meeting, the fact that they were discussing this kind of ethnic cleansing was leaked. And it led to massive protests against this kind of a racist policy in Germany. That was just a few years ago. Now, that first reaction that, oh my God, this is ethnic cleansing, it's coming from extremists, it should be rejected, you almost don't remember that because at this point, the idea of remigration has been accepted by several far right political parties. President Trump actually tweeted on Truth Social, remigration now during the campaign. We have people like Andy Ogles and other who are part of the Republican mainstream discussing remigration. The State Department under Marco Rubio has proposed an Office of Remigration, which hasn't been established yet. So yeah, this is picking up in the United States where people are sanctioning this kind of idea and also in other parts of the world.
Yeah, locally, I've been following a new group that has emerged, and I'm looking at some of their tweets. America for ethnic Americans. They talk about removing all foreigners from our homeland. And I'm flipping through some here. Native Americans are white. They talk about Vivek Ramaswamy not being an American. They they say Amy Coney Barrett is unfit to rule on birthright citizenship because she has adopted foreign black children. They say the Supreme Court is illegitimate because of Ketanji Jackson. That they even have a tweet saying there may be a need for a return of extrajudicial justice. How should people in my community view a group such as this?
Well, that's some scary stuff, especially when you talk about extrajudicial justice. Look, this idea of ethnic Americans or heritage Americans, that's just a code word for white, right? This is a white supremacist idea. And from the posts that you're reading to me of this group, their racism runs deep, right? They're attacking a Supreme Court justice who's adopted some black kids. They're attacking a black justice. They're calling for extrajudicial actions. This is not for the faint-hearted. Now, as far as folks in your community are concerned, for the most part, white supremacist groups aren't necessarily a problem unless you start seeing a rash of hate crimes. What is a problem is that their ideas can be inspirational to the kinds of people who have committed mass attacks. So, remigration is the policy solution to something called the Great Replacement. This is another white supremacist idea that somehow there is a plot, sometimes they blame Jews for it, globalists, others, to replace white people with people of color, refugees, immigrants, etc., in their home countries. That idea has been around for a longer time than remigration and has spread throughout white supremacists all over the world. Remigration is the policy solution, right? Forcibly removing people. People who believe in the Great Replacement have committed the mass attacks at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, the El Paso Walmart in 2019, and others targeting Jews, Muslims, immigrants, etc. That's what's scary about this rhetoric. Will it inspire somebody to do something like that?
I was watching a video of one of this group's gatherings. They had, it appeared to be maybe a couple of hundred young men, and and they talked about, well, we're not about hate, we're about loving our own people. What's going on in this country, especially with young men, that this is an appealing concept?
Well, there has been a huge growth in groups like you're describing, filled with young white men who are involved in things like MMA activities, weightlifting, etc. These are called active clubs. There were none 3.5 years ago. Now there's dozens and dozens. There's also a youth club, which is a version of this for kids who are under 18, and they're now in every single state. There's no question that there has been some appeal to young white men in terms of white supremacy. And we have more white supremacists and more white supremacist groups like this than we've ever had in the United States. And I would argue that's somewhat to some extent the result of the sanctioning of racism coming out of the White House and the Republican Party towards immigrants and others. It's a climate that is extremely polarized. It's these are the kinds of young men who deride, the woke folks, feminists, etc. And they're growing. They're finding a home there. And it's very, very concerning.
Last question. The title of my publication is "Hate Comes to Main Street." Uh, does this question of remigration belong under the heading of hate?
Absolutely. I can't think of anything more hateful. You're proposing ethnic cleansing of black and brown people from countries. This is more extreme than anything any anti-immigrant movement has ever proposed before. So yes, it's about as hateful as it could possibly be. Frankly, it's downright scary. And when I hear a policy suggestion from a former neo-Nazi being tweeted out by the president, I don't know how it is that we got to this place. This would have been absolutely unacceptable prior to the Trump era. And yet here we are with remigration being something, coming out from a presidential candidate who would go on to win.
Which brings up one more question. How do we push back?
Well, I think it's really important to do things like this, which is discuss what remigration is, make clear, because people might not know. They might hear it and they might think, oh, that's just deporting, criminals or bad guys, which most people agree should be done. So awareness is important and speaking out is important. These are all things that need to happen to push back against this agenda. And, standing with immigrants in the face of this, making clear that you're not a racist, being an upstander, all of these things are important. And frankly, I think at the local level, when communities go out and say, we're against this kind of stuff, we are a welcoming place for all of our citizens, that makes that's a big deal and can really help push back.
Well, Heidi, I appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks, Phil. I appreciate being here.